Part 6, Chapter 4, and Section 6-5008 is as follows. First, to serve in an advisory capacity to assist and advise the Atlanta City Council with regard to the adoption of an amendment to the city's development impact fee ordinance or any new development impact fee ordinance. 2, to receive annual report required by OCGA 36-71-8D2, and if warranted upon review of the annual report, submit a written report to the Atlanta City Council of any perceived inequities in the expenditure of impact fees collected for roads, streets, including right-of-way, traffic signals, landscaping, or any local component of state or federal highways. Third, pursuant to OCGA 36-71-5C, no action of the committee shall be considered a necessary prerequisite for action by the Atlanta City Council in regard to the adoption of a development impact fee ordinance. Until further notice, the meetings of the City of Atlanta Development Impact Fee Advisory Committee will continue virtually via Zoom. We ask for your patience in the event of any technical difficulties that may cause committee members to experience lost or interrupted connection. Staff has muted all microphones, and we ask that all participants remain muted for the duration of the meeting unless you have been recognized by the chair. This will minimize background noise and feedback and ensure that all participants can hear the comments clearly. For the benefit of anyone who has called in, I will ask all committee members to please identify yourselves each time you speak, make or second a motion, or vote. At the appropriate time, please click on participants to use the raise hand feature found at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to be recognized to speak. If you are calling in, you may use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute or unmute at the appropriate time. Public comment received via the COA impact fees at atlantanga.gov mailbox up to 1 hour before each meeting will be read by staff during the first public comment period and posted online via the impact fee update webpage. At this point, I will take roll call to confirm a quorum and call the meeting to order. Jim Brown. Looks like he's absent. Roderick Teachy.
Present.
Kevin Green.
Here.
Stacy McCoy. Looks like Stacy is absent. With 3 members present, we do have a quorum and we'll proceed with the meeting. A copy of the agenda for today's meeting was sent to committee members and can be found on our website. Staff will type in a link to the agenda into the chat. At this time, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Kevin Green, so moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Rod, say your name before you say anything, just for the...
Rod Teachy, second.
Thank you. Seeing we have a second, we will take a vote on the approval of the agenda. Jim Brown, sorry, he's not here. Rod Teachy.
Approve.
Kevin Green.
Approve.
The motion carries with the, Malloy Peterson approved. The motion carries with a vote of 3 yeas, 0 nays. Next, I will entertain a motion to adopt the March 12th, 2020 meeting minutes.
Rod Teachy, so moved.
Kevin Green, second.
Seeing we have a second, we'll take a vote on the approval of the March 12, 2020 meeting minutes. Rod Teachy.
Approve.
Kevin Green.
Aye.
Malloy Peterson votes aye. The motion carries with a vote of 3 yeas, 0 nays. Now staff will read public comments received via the COA impact fees mailbox.
Madam Chair, there are no comments received in the impact fee mailbox.
Thank you. Our next agenda item relates to the most recently updated impact fee study draft and ordinance update. Members have received copies of these in advance and are prepared to discuss the final draft. We all have in attendance today Mr. Clancy Mullen from Duncan Associates, who is the consultant partnering with the Department of City Planning and a principal writer of the draft update. He will discuss the updated draft and provide an overview of the edits made.
Before we get started, this is Kevin. I just want a record to reflect that Stacy has joined us.
Let the record reflect. Stacy McCoy has joined the meeting.
Yes.
Okay, for the record, Clancy Mullin with Duncan Associates. We did prepare a revised draft. The first one was in April. I think you got a presentation May on that from staff. And really, so I just wanted to go over what the changes were in the revised draft again. The first one, you don't want to have to read the whole thing to tell what's changed. But basically, very little change of substance. There were nothing changed of substance in terms of the amounts of the fees, methodology.
Clancy, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Is anybody else having a problem?
I can't, I'm having trouble as well.
Sorry. We weren't having this earlier. Let me see if I can adjust the mic here.
Let me try this mic. Can you guys still hear me?
That's great.
Oh, is that better?
That's great. You might need to start from the top.
Okay. Clancy Mullin with Duncan Associates. We're the consultant to the city for the impact fee study update. And you got the original draft of the study in April. In April. You had a presentation on that in May from staff. And this most recent draft was prepared at the end of October, and it was really designed to make it easier for the Department of Community Affairs to review for the purposes of approving the capital improvements element. It was not really originally designed to be the capital improvements element, and still is not really the capital improvements element. It's the study. The element could be a separate document. It could be the same, could be part of the study. So we added a capital improvements element chapter that puts all the stuff that Department of Community Affairs needs to review in one place, so they don't have to look through the whole report to find it. As part of that, we added a rationale for using the park service areas for the transportation service areas as well, having them be the same boundaries, because they wanted to see that. We put the levels of service in there, put it up front. They were in the individual chapters. You kind of had to really look for them. They wanted to see a 5-year growth projection of needs. So we put made some adjustments to the, basically added to Appendix A, the land use appendix, those projected land uses. And then in the capital improvements chapter that immediately follows the executive summary now, we had, we put projections of capital needs based on those projections of future land uses. We made a few other little tweaks. We moved the current system evaluation chapter, which had been the second chapter right after the executive summary. We put it right before the appendices, just as a, it's a lot of background information that you don't necessarily need to read through to understand the study. So it would just seem to flow a little better if we put it later in the report. And that's about it. So no substantive changes, no changes to the fee amounts, to the methodology, to the recommendations, other than a little wordsmithing. It's basically the same study with those additions to hopefully expedite DCA review. And if you have any questions about the study, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
This, Malloy Peterson, I had one quick question. You talked about the growth projections in Appendix A, but I don't know that I saw that. Did the rest of you get that? You did? Okay, sorry. Maybe my printer cut off.
Yeah, it now has projections for 2025. We had, I think, 2020 and I can't remember what we had before. We always had the 2040 projections, but I don't know that we had an interim projection between 2020 and 2040.
I have one more question. The levels of service for the parks. And I think it's on page 18 or so.
Well, that's in transportation.
30, it's Kevin, it's 36, I think.
Yeah, do you mind walking through the levels of service?
The level of service for all the
Just the parks.
parks?
Someone asked a question about it and
Yeah, that might be a little bit confusing because for the other fees, we had a consistent, so we're using equivalents. So like equivalent square feet for fire and police, we're using equivalent lane miles. And those costs don't really change by area. But for parks, we're using equivalent acres. And of course, the different service areas have different cost per acre. So if we wanted to get a uniform citywide fee, we had to have levels of service that varied by area. Whereas for the other three, we could just pick the lowest one in terms of, I mean, we did pick the lowest one, but it depends on which factor you're looking at. Sorry, it's a little confusing.
yeah, I think that might be nice if we were able to note that. I didn't see it said specifically, but I remember speaking about that previously, but it might be nice. Maybe that I'm missing it, but it might be nice to sort of write out the rationale behind that.
Madam Chair, sorry to interrupt. I do want to recognize that we have Mr. Jim Brown has joined the call.
Okay, thank you.
So you wanted, is this something you want to see in the study, added to the study, or could it be separate? Do we need to?
Yeah, it was just a note because I had been asked about it a couple times, what that actually meant. It might be nice to just have maybe a little more on the explanation of that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, because we've got the level of service chapter or section of the report starting on page 36, but then the actual recommended levels of service, which differ by service area, are actually on page 38, which is the cost per service unit section, because we needed to get the cost before we could figure out in order to have a uniform fee. So that was driving the whole thing. But yeah, we can explain that better.
Does anybody else have any other questions? For those of you who are joining us late, a little bit later, we're really just kind of discussing the updates that he made. He just walked us through the highlights of about 4 or 5 main changes that he made, not necessarily in content, some of it in structure.
Oh, this is Kevin. I don't have any questions. I just found the report to be pretty intuitive and helpful. So I like the way it was laid out, and it anticipated and answered a lot of questions.
Yeah, I agree on that. I mean, it was, we've obviously, all of us on this board have come a long way. Malloy Peterson, I did not announce myself. We've come a long way in our understanding of this, but I really did feel like it was a very complete read. Good work. Okay, so are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Clancy, for that update and for all the work you've done on this thus far. Our next agenda item we have is the City Planning Department is prepared to discuss the next steps to final adoption of the updated impact fee study draft.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Tiffany Cope with the Business Operations Team with the Department of City Planning. So I will share my screen here to cover the final areas that require further discussion and your final recommendations so that we can move forward with the adoption process. So give me a few seconds here to share my screen and we'll proceed. Are you all able to see the presentation? Okay, great.
Yes.
So there are several areas that require further discussion and your final recommendations. Starting timeline for adoption, timeline for adopting a new fee study and associated ordinance, potential phasing or percentage adoption of recommended fee levels, determine guidelines for grandfathered developments already in progress, select preferred single-family fee structure option, develop reporting structure to improve transparency on proximity, finalize affordability and economic development language in the ordinance, and lastly, the size of service areas. In addition to going through the preliminary recommendations, I will also present the timeline and next steps required. So for starters, the area that requires, oh, my apologies there. The first area that requires your further discussion and finalization is the timeline to implement any fee changes associated with development impact fees. So the current staff recommendation is to finalize the adoption of the ordinance March of 2021. And with that adoption date, we're looking forward to a July 1st effective date, with July 1st being the first fee increase as well. So using that July 1st effective date as the first fee increase as well. Next.
And before you move on, Tiffany, can we ask questions here?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, what is the reason for the staff recommendation to wait 6 months before the effective date of the ordinance?
Well, the train of thought here, as you will see later in the presentation, is for some of those grandfathered or near-term projects that are still in progress, it would give them by default a grace period of such, so that we wouldn't have to adopt a special program for those grandfathered projects. So by default, using those dates, that timeline will provide adequate notice for that fee increase.
And this is Janet E. Siddlefall. Just to add to that, it's kind of an either or type of situation where we had discussed a 6-month period to a 6-month grace period. However, due to the delays that we did not expect from the review of the impact fee study by DCA, it's kind of shrinked our timeline. So we could either choose to do a 6-month timeframe grace period, or we could do, we're estimating that we would have by March completion of the whole adoption process. So we could think of something from March to July as well. So that it's really an either or kind of situation.
Okay, I'm sorry, this is Kevin. I'm just, I mean, I know that there's been a sense of urgency to get this done after waiting 27 years. Given the fact that, you know, your initial year is 50% of the proposed increase. Yeah, that does make some of the items go up a little bit. You know, ironically for office, the amount of impact fees charged would go down with that 50%. So I just wonder, you know, do you need to tack more notice time onto this thing, or can't we just get this moving? Because you're gonna have a full year.
I'll say a little bit here. I think there's projects, if you have capital lined up and you're already, like, it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, like if you're in the process of, you know, getting your capital finalized legally. And if you haven't been given the heads up, because we wouldn't announce it till January. If you hadn't been given the heads up, I mean, it could literally stop and pause projects. I will say this is just something that I've heard a ton of input on. Is just, you got to give a little bit of notice, because it for big projects, it can be, even for small projects, it could actually be the biggest needle mover. So, you know, from the development side, I would say I feel like it's in good form to give. I mean, it would be, if you announced it in January and you imposed it in January, I just think there'd be a major backlash.
Yeah, this is Kevin again. My question is, aren't there grandfather provisions baked into the ordinance though already?
No, there are not.
Okay, I must.
And that's why when we initially talked about grandfather, this is Janet E. Siddlefield speaking again. When we initially talked about grandfathering, our solution to grandfathering was to give a period of time for a grace period. And we had initially hoped that we would have adopted the new ordinance in January and be able to adopt and implement the new fee structure in July. As you can see, we have been delayed. We're still awaiting comments from DCA on the fee study. And so as a result of that, we do not anticipate to have a new adopted fee structure until March. If we adopt a new fee structure in March, and we still are intent on implementing that new fee structure in July, that gives about 3 months notice. So do we want to go with a 3-month notice? Do we want to go with the 6-month grace period that we initially discussed? That's the question before you.
Yeah, I get
Or
it.
do we want to go with something else?
This is Rod Teachy. I have a quick question on that. So would this be imposed for projects that have submitted their initial permit application before July or after? In other words, it may or may not, you may or may not be able to get your permits within a 6-month period. So if you apply before July and then you get your permit after July, which is when you pay your impact fees, are you gonna have to pay a higher fee, or because you submitted an application before July, you're gonna come in under the lower fees?
That's a great question. We will have Jonathan Fertrell from our legal team on a call with us a little later, and he can kind of speak to those nuances with that process.
I think in our initial discussions, this is Janet E. Siddlefield speaking. In our initial discussions, we had discussed the potential of having those who had applications in progress before the adoption of the new ordinance.
So essentially at this point, you'd have 3 months to get in your application to come in under the lower fees.
If we choose to adopt, if we choose to adopt the March to July timeframe, yes.
Yeah, just to echo what Malloy was saying, particularly with affordable housing, even a small increase in impact fees can really break a deal. And from my industry, I think we need to give people a minimum of 6 months notice that, hey, 6 months from now, your fees are going to go up. So I would vote for the 6 month notice.
Yeah, and to throw something in about with Rod, I know a lot of us, obviously, who are on this committee and people who also are on this committee and people who are very involved in industry associations are watching this. But I'm just thinking of somebody who, is not up, and this will be a surprise to them. It honestly feels like 3 is a little short. 6 feels a little fair. I do understand totally that we're trying to, bump this up, but it sort of feels like, it's still like that's the right amount of time to me. Just for the information to be disseminated and for people to change their pro formas and communicate that with their capital partners and get it in for permitting.
Thank you. Okay, so in our conversation with fees, the next area that requires your final recommendation is the preferred method to implement a new fee structure, to phase in the fees over time, or assess 100% of fees at once. So this is what we were discussing a few moments ago. We are looking to phase in the fees over a 2-year period with 3 increases in that time frame. So again, back to what we discussed, the first fee increase would be imposed on the effective date of the ordinance. And for the remainder of the first year, that increase would be calculated at 50%. Fees charged in the second year after effective date will be calculated at 75%. And lastly, fees charged in the third year going forward will be calculated at 100%. So that's the phase-in approach the staff has recommended. Okay, my screen isn't moving. Okay. The next question, how should we deal with the near-term projects in progress that may be financially impacted by rate changes? I think we've all kind of know where you guys lean towards this. But again, the ordinance has an estimated date of adoption of March of 2021, again, with the recommended effective date of July 1st. That is, again, that 4-month notice we discussed with that phasing in structure. But again, we do look to you all for your final recommendations there. What is your preferred single-family home rate structure? In other words, should the rates be based on square footage or a single flat rate for all single-family homes? The current preliminary recommendation is to implement a single flat rate structure rather than rates based on square footage. And of course, that would simplify the accounting process. And doesn't seem to be a great advantage or benefit to basing the rates on square footage. So that is the preliminary recommendation.
And Tiffany, is that also because a lot of the impacts for park, transportation, police are similar based on the number of people in a house versus how big it is? Is that sort of the reasoning? Or
I'm not, Janet, are you able to speak to that, or Clancy? Is it based on the parks service areas?
Oh, sorry. Clancy here. It's because, well, the recommendation is because it's pretty small difference. It's like plus or minus 10%, I guess, going from a under 1,500 square foot to the 1,500 to 2,500 square foot, which is where most homes are either that or in the upper range. You don't get very many of those smaller homes, but it would be about a 10% reduction. So I guess that's, what are we talking about? Talking about $400. $400 plus or minus. Given the price of a new home, it's such a small amount that it doesn't seem really would be a big benefit, a big incentive for affordable housing, I guess, would be which I think would be the reason you would want to go that way. And it would be a little more complicated to administer. So that was the rationale.
This is Rod Tichy. So honestly, I don't think we should be using the fact that it may be a little more complicated for us to figure out the fee as an excuse. But besides that point, I do feel like first of all, there's a big push, everybody knows, for affordable housing in the city. And along with that, we're seeing an increase in what we're calling tiny homes or smaller homes that are as small as 600 or 800 square feet. And I just have a problem with a person who's buying an 800 square foot house to pay the same fee that someone's buying a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot house. Clearly, there's a difference in the ability to pay that fee on the end user. And in my opinion, those smaller houses that are going to be geared towards affordable housing and lower income folks are going to carry a disproportionate share of the fees.
Yeah, can you all explain also how that relates back to some of the ability to not, like in the affordable housing section, there were some exclusions to paying. So how do these two reconcile with each other?
Clancy Mullen here. You're talking about the exemptions, affordable housing exemptions or waivers. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the preferred way to go for truly affordable housing. But it may not address, I mean, that's going to be how, I think those exemptions are going to be more limited to units that are going to be affordable for 20 years. At least that was the plan in the ordinance last time I heard. So, I mean, it could go either way on it. I don't think it's a big administrative burden probably, and I don't think it'll make a big difference on affordability, but yeah, I mean, $400 if those small homes are really pretty cheap and they're not getting an exemption, it would be a modest benefit, I guess. Yeah.
This is Kevin. I mean, just going by the tiered options that were presented in the fee study for single family, it's less than 1,500 square feet on the low end. It's over 2,500 on the high end, and the middle is the middle between 1,500 and 2,500. But the total amount is, $350 between the small and the large. That's the delta between the fees.
And these are paid by the developer. I mean, I guess the developer, if they're building their own home, if you're building your own tiny home, then the developer's the consumer. I guess I'm thinking about what Rod said, and I guess in my mind, I keep thinking that if it's affordable housing, it's already getting an exclusion. But could there be a case for a tiny home that wouldn't qualify for affordable housing? I just don't know enough about the breakpoints.
Well, I think this just goes back, this is Janet Settlefall speaking. I think this just goes back to the whole point of, yes, we could do a tiered structure that would allow for, that would be based on square footage. But the whole thinking was, if it's only $350 or about $350 between, that's the delta, is that something that, because it would take a greater effort to be able to administer that type of program, that kind of a tiered program, as to a single flat rate structure. And we can do it either way. The question is, what is the preference?
Well, just Rod Teachy, just to kind of follow what I said before, to clarify, I'm more focused on the smaller homes that are geared towards affordable housing and low income purchasers. So if there's already a waiver for that, then I'd probably be more amenable to having the flat rate.
Yeah. And we actually have a recommendation to move forward with some affordable housing exemption language that we will get to in the next series of slides.
Yeah, I think as a follow-up, we can just make as a note that we want to make sure that sort of what Rod is talking about is covered through the exemption. And if for some reason it isn't, that it would be carved out of here, just since we don't 100% know every detail about the affordable.
Okay, thank you for your feedback there. I would like to note that the staff recommendations, these recommendations came from surveying stakeholders with the survey that we conducted earlier this year. So it kind of encompasses, participants that engaged in this process from all different industries, and who had a stake in this process. So I did want to point that out. I apologize for not stating that earlier. Let me get my computer back working here. There we go. So the next area that requires final recommendation is question 5. What suggestions do you have for annual reporting to improve transparency of the program? So there are a couple recommendations that are up front. And the first is, of course, the Impact Advisory Committee. We do look to you all to report any perceived inequities in the expenditure of transportation impact fees. And those perceived inequities could arise from there being no reasonable proximity or level of service improvement to areas where impact fees were collected and expended. Of course, if you all do perceive any inequities, we will look to you to report those to City Council and therefore. Also, in addition to the advisory committee, city staff has developed a transportation impact fee distribution analysis to aid you all in your judgment with that, with perceived inequities. And that distribution analysis comprises of maps that will list locations where impact fees were collected and encumbered for transportation service areas within the last 5 years. It also aggregates the collection and encumbrance data based on the 3 proposed service areas, again, to highlight the relationship between where impact fees were collected and where they were expended. Next, what changes would you recommend to
Tiffany, just one second, please.
Sure.
This is Janice Siddlefall, just to remind the Impact Fee Advisory Committee. This is the analysis that we shared with you very earlier this year, sorry. It already feels like a year should have passed. That showed basically where we collected and where we encumbered impact fees. And they were the heat maps that give an illustration of just, the proximity of collections and expenditures as best as is possible right now with the GIS tools that we have available. And as we committed, we're going to constantly be looking at ways to improve how that information is illustrated and reflected as we move through different CIEs. But for right now, that is the tool that we all felt most comfortable with. And we'd like to proceed as that being a recommendation to City Council as to a way to improve transparency, the transparency of the program, as we search for other ways to do so and support that.
This is Malloy Peterson. Would it be possible for, I can't remember where we actually left it with that map, but would it be possible to make a recommendation that we have something that's a little bit like an interactive map? You wouldn't have to have every single detail of where money was spent, but maybe like large numbers. So I think the heat map that you are talking about was the one that was in the PowerPoint presentation.
That's correct.
If we could make it a goal to one day have an interactive map, I think that'd be great.
Sure.
And
I
this-
mean, I think that, but the level of interaction is what I would wonder about, because the map, the heat map as presented earlier this year is based off of actual data. So there's very little means for interacting with the representation of the actual data. Now, if we're looking to as we gain input for CIE updates annually, that is an opportunity to invite more interaction, because then based off of that map, we could see how stakeholder recommendations on potential projects or upcoming developments would reflect on that map.
So, okay, Janity, what I was saying was more like that you could roll over it and see this much spent in this area, not necessarily interactive with the public or public.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. If we could just make it digital, digitize it instead of it being a PowerPoint slide.
I got you.
Yeah.
You're saying by year, by
Correct.
park district. Yes,
Exactly.
yes.
We got you.
Yeah, this is Kevin. I would also concur with Malloy. I think we've all recognized that there hasn't been a lot of transparency around the nexus between who's paying and where the investment is being made. And while the heat map is helpful, kind of illustratively, there needs to be more ability to probe behind the image and understand what's really going on. So yeah, and just repeating really what Malloy and Stacy just said.
I got you. That makes sense. And I think that's something that we can definitely work towards.
All right, our next area of discussion are the impact fee exemptions. First are the affordable housing exemption language. What changes would you recommend to the preliminary affordable housing exemption language? For rental development, affordable housing recommendation are for developments that allocate at least 15% of their units to households with less than 80% AMI, as well as developments that allocate at least 10% of their units to households with less than 60% AMI. So here we are looking towards the committee to offer your recommendation on what that percentage would be for developments that meet that criteria. For sale development affordable housing, the recommendation is on a sliding scale from 100%, 120% AMI based on inclusionary zoning standards. From 120% AMI will receive a 50% exemption. Households with less than 100% AMI will receive 75% exemption. And households with less than 80% AMI or below would receive 100% exemption from impact fees. And as stated earlier, developments must be affordable at least for 20 years. Should affordable housing exemptions apply to the entire development or just the portion that is affordable? So the current recommendation is the exemption will only apply to the individual units that are affordable and not the entire development. Next is the language for the economic development exemption. So currently a project must meet the goals and objectives of the 2020 Economic Development and Economic Mobility Strategy. So a project must meet the criteria of one of these three in order to receive 100% exemption of impact fees. The first criteria is retention, expansion, or location of a business within the city's south or west side that create at least 50 or more middle wage full-time equivalent positions. Must retention, expansion, or location of a business outside of the south or west side that creates at least 200 middle wage full-time equivalent positions. And lastly, retention, expansion, or location of a business anywhere in the city that creates at least 500 jobs or at least $10 million in capital investment. So if either one of those criteria are met, the project will qualify for the impact fee exemption. And lastly, would you consider reducing the size of service areas or using council districts as service areas? So the preliminary recommendation as we have it is to continue using the designated 3 park service areas, north, south, and west side for parks as well as transportation impact fees. And the rationale there is based on DCA's general recommendation is to use the least number of service areas as needed to achieve your goal. Also, too many service areas could also limit and reduce flexibility in how you can spend impact fees. And having too many service areas, such as based on council districts, may increase the time frame that each area will take to accumulate enough funds for the needed improvements. And if service areas are too small regarding reducing those areas, there may never be enough money for major improvements. And finally, if a service area is too large, improvements may not benefit to the contributing development. So we recommend, or not we, I guess the stakeholders' recommendation was to continue using the 3 service areas, again, for parks as well as transportation. Okay. So the next steps to final adoption. We, again, as stated, we're looking to have the ordinance finalized and adopted by March. So of course now, December 16th, we are reviewing preliminary recommendations. We are looking to receive approval from DCA on the study within the next couple of days here. So hopefully by December 18th, that's the tentative date we anticipate approval. Our next DIFAC meeting will be held January 20th, where we will review your final recommendations. Early February, we're looking to host a council member work session to go over the study and again, those final recommendations for the ordinance. February 23rd, we're looking to go before CDHS for their vote to move the ordinance forward. March 1st, we're looking to go before full council for final adoption vote. And lastly, the current recommendation is for the ordinance to go into effect July 1st. Okay, Madam Chair, I yield the floor back to you.
Thanks for that presentation. Can I ask sort of a technical question of you?
Sure.
Next meeting, we sort of vote on those recommendations?
Yes.
We make a vote. So how do we know what's voted on? Do we one of us make a motion for each one of those steps? And if somebody has a separate one to vote on, if there's dual ones, then 2 people would put them forth and you'd vote on each?
That's a good question. Janet, can you speak to the typical protocol? I know doing it virtually is a little different. Do we still have Janity with us?
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
Oh, no problem.
I think that would be the best way to go, to vote on each. Because trying to do them collectively, you may have, diverging opinions that may need further discussion. So if you vote on each, in that way, you'd be able to have whatever discussion you needed to around them, and then vote to move forward with each recommendation based off of that discussion.
Does anybody have any other questions on that in terms of process?
This is Kevin. I got a question. Staff has obviously put a lot of thought into this. Is there any intention of staff to fill in some of the blanks in terms of recommended exemption for affordable housing at some of those cut points that you talked about? They were just left as, XX percentage.
That's correct. We've been having, Janity Siddlefall again, having some discussions around how we ensure that the percentage of exemption is consistent with other affordable housing initiatives and policies that we have ongoing. And so we're kind of coalescing around some level of consistency, so that, if we are allowing a certain percentage for rental, we would allow that same percentage for sale. And we're hoping, as we go closer to finding funding sources, because as I'm sure you recognize, we tried last year during the General Assembly to pass legislation to exempt us from having to replace funding used for exempting affordable housing from paying impact fees, and that was not passed. So we, it's really a kind of trying to get our hands around, it's not worth giving 100% affordable housing if we know that we can't pay for 100% affordable housing. There are several initiatives that are underway right now that would allow us to find different mechanisms for funding affordable housing. And so we'd really be taking a gut feel stab at, what that percentage should be. And right now we're kind of coalescing around something or anything between 30 and 50% for both for sale and rental affordable housing. Does that answer your question?
Just Kevin, yeah, kind of. I mean, I guess it's just hard for this committee to come up with a percentage if staff can't come up with a percentage after all the analysis that's been done. So that's a real kind of head scratcher to me.
Well, the reason it's a head scratcher is right. We don't want to, or we'd like to try to get away from saying we'll exempt this much for affordable housing, when we know that right now we don't really have any dedicated funding to fund those exemptions. So there are several policies that we're pursuing right now that we hope will pass. We're looking at a housing opportunity bond. We are looking at legislation to allow the state to allow cities and other municipalities to be able to fund affordable housing from other sources. So there's a lot of policy that is kind of in progress. We don't have the results of that right now. So we're really, doing kind of what we think might be best kind of guess. And so it's going to take a little longer conversation, I think, with a few others before we actually settle on, what we think might be a a good recommendation in terms of the percentage. And I hope we can do that before we finalize this legislation, because I think we want to give you guys the best recommendation that we can. And we definitely want to put forth a strong recommendation to council when this ordinance goes before them.
So can it be finalized without a percentage?
I would have to, I mean, I think we have somebody from our law team on board.
I would assume that we have to have a percentage before it was finalized.
John,
Yeah.
Jonathan
this is,
Cottrell from our law department is with us. Jonathan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Janity, and I completely agree. It should be codified. Unless we were able to create some sort of administrative rulemaking authority to have that. But I don't think that's a good idea. When you're dealing with fees, it's really been consistent that the law department's position is that fees, and this of course would be an exemption to those fees, need to be codified. So my recommendation would be that yes, it should be codified. So the decision should be made whenever council acts.
And so we would need a percentage by our next meeting in January.
Or at least by, I guess, before, when is this going before for the first read, Janity or Tiffany?
February 23rd.
Okay. So I would say at least before then, no question.
But we only meet one more time before that. Is that correct, Tiffany?
Yes, that's correct.
So I think from our perspective, we would need a percentage by the January meeting.
Yes.
As I said, I think we're prepared to have some additional discussions with some stakeholders to make a recommendation to you. But for right now, there've just been a lot of different moving parts, some of which, I mean, just as of yesterday, one of our committees passed the housing opportunity bond. So, there have been a lot of moving parts as we try to contemplate what the best, percentage for exemption would be. And all of those moving parts may still not be in place when we have to make a recommendation. So we will be making a recommendation based on the best information available at the current time. And that's really why we still kind of have X's in the legislation as it stands now, but we want to make sure that we bring it to you as one of those areas that we will need a recommendation on as we finalize the ordinance.
So this is Kevin. Follow-up question on that. I mean, as I understand, for any exemption, you got to have replacement funds that are non-impact fee replacement funds, right? So you got to have a fund, a pot of money to backfill any exemption. And assuming that doesn't get changed in terms of the General Assembly, then that's what we're left with. Couldn't you make a recommended percentage, assuming, or in the event that there is replacement funds that are available, and so the percentage is contingent on that? Because if you don't have replacement funds available, you can't grant an exemption anyway.
Anyway, exactly.
So why do we need to wait to come up with a percentage if the percentage is contingent on there being replacement funds available anyway?
Well, I mean, Kevin, if you'd really like to look at it that way, we could say they could be 100% exempt from impact fees if that's what we choose to do to encourage more affordable housing.
Well, I mean, there's different, AMIs too. It's just, there's a lot of moving parts. It's hard, at least for me, to get my head around how to give an intelligent answer to that fill in the X question. Related to that is economic development. there's new criteria that's introduced here in terms of what qualifies as an economic development project. And obviously that needs replacement funds as well. What I wasn't clear though is that an automatic exemption, or is there got to be some determination by council that project is exempt for economic development purposes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but we're proposing that it meet those criteria and it would have an automatic 100% exemption, correct, Jonathan?
That's right. Currently, as it's drafted, if you meet it, the director could sign off on saying, exemption, again, to Kevin's point, if the exemption funds are there, the replacement funds are there, it would not require additional council approval, at least as drafted currently.
Okay, that's cool. I just noticed on the ordinance that it said, if you qualify, you may get an exemption instead of shall. That was one of the reasons for my question.
No, and that's a fair point. I mean, it could be, the director shall grant it, but I think that would be another policy decision whether there would be any discretion. But I think to your point, shall might be more appropriate here because it doesn't have to go before council, but I don't think there's a mechanism right now that where the director could say, no, I'm sorry, you don't get this. So perhaps shall would be more appropriate.
Okay.
And I use the 100% because economic development is 100%. And so if we want to apply the same policy to affordable housing, that's a consideration.
Okay. Malloy Peterson, I had one last question. Maybe it's for Clancy or maybe Janity. In the recommendations, I think I read there's a 6-year timeline in which the fees have to be expended. Once they're returned, is that correct?
Once they're encumbered, yes, they have 6 years to expend.
Okay, is that the same that it was previously, or was it 5 years previously?
Jonathan, I think it's the same.
Yeah, I believe it's the same. That's I'll confirm it right now, but I believe that's set out by state law that if they're not encumbered within 6 years, their refund is due. So it's the encumberment that's the important box to be checked there.
Right, encumbered. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions from the group, we'd like to thank everybody on this committee for all the work that's been put forth, and from staff and Tiffany and Janity and the legal department. I know has spent a lot of hours behind the scenes. So we are working toward delivering the first update to the impact fee study and ordinance in almost 30 years. Next, we'll open up for the second public comment period. Staff will mute and unmute calls as raised hands in order of receipt and read comments in the chat. Please click on participants to use the raise hand feature found at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to be recognized to speak. If you're calling in, you may use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute or unmute at the appropriate time.
Okay, Madam Chair, we have 2 hands raised. Ms. Kate Little, you may proceed with your question. You may unmute yourself and proceed. And if you can, please state the organization you're with.
Miss Little, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Does somebody have to unmute her?
Can we unmute her?
No, she's able to unmute herself. Let's see. Okay, Ms. Little may have stepped away. I will go to the next raised hand. Ms. Tiffany Hogan, you may unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, yes, thank you. I apologize if I missed this. If the plan is approved to implement the fees in increments, what are the increments that it will be implemented as? Do we know that yet?
Yes, the first increment will take place on the effective date of the ordinance. And throughout the first year, the exemption will be 50%. For the second year, it will be 75%. And lastly, in the third year, it will be 100% of the fee increase, excuse me, not exemption, fee increase.
Perfect, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Ms. Little, are you with us?
If she is having trouble unmuting, is there any other way? I guess if she's on the computer for her to put it in the chat or anything?
Yes. She's going to put her question in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, while we wait for Ms. Little's question, Ms. Hogan, I see your hand is raised again. Do you have a question for us? If so, you may unmute yourself and proceed.
I do, Ms. Cope, thank you so much. I heard at the beginning there was discussion regarding whether we would proceed with the March timeframe, and some of the committee members recommended 6 months instead. When will we know whether it will be that 3-month recommendation for March or the committee's 6-month recommendation?
Well, I think we'll be voting in January on the recommendation. Is that correct, Tiffany? And right now, we're discussing it right now, but we will vote in the January 20th meeting.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Sorry, this is Kate Little. I had to dial in by phone. My computer actually doesn't have a mic, so thank you for your patience. I actually have 2 questions. In terms of the home sales and being affordable for 20 years if they qualify for an exemption, I just wonder how you monitor that. That's my first question. Will it be deed restrictions, or how would that be implemented?
I would defer your question to Jonathan. Are you able to answer Ms. Little's question regarding affordable housing?
Yes, it would be very similar to the IZ program, where it would be a land use restriction agreement.
Okay, I actually thought the IZ program just referred to, or just was applicable to rental housing, not home ownership.
That's right. That's right. This correct. The IZ is currently just rental, but here this would expand that and apply to both rental and to home ownership.
And my second question might be a little more difficult, and this is really out of my sphere of expertise, but just curious, in terms of the number of jobs created for economic development, as just a citizen of Atlanta, I would like to see the employer or the business having some responsibility to make those jobs available to City of Atlanta residents first. And again, I don't know how that would be implemented or if that's even possible, but I just want to put that out there as food for thought. And then I have a comment that also may be out of line, but I noticed in the projections for 2020, the population is actually at less than 500,000. And I don't know that Congress or the Census Bureau is going to come back and look. But I know in order to qualify for CARES Act funding, the mayor made a pitch that the city population was actually 550,000, so as to qualify for automatic or it's not automatic, to qualify for entitlement funding. So to have another official document at less than 500,000 population just seems to me awkward. Thank you.
Good point.
Were the population numbers that are in the projections, were those from Clancy's group?
Correct.
Actually, those are interpolations between data provided by Atlantic Regional Commission. And I think their projections were, this was actually the projections were actually done in the 2017 study, and they're based on 2015 estimates and 2040 projections, so interpolations between those dates. So it's a pretty rough number. You know, it may or may not be accurate.
More actual numbers from the city of Atlanta? Is that something we could look into if the city of Atlanta has more current figures?
We would have to have them by census tract in order to divide them up between the service areas. But yes, if we could get comparable numbers, it also have to be non-residential numbers. Although, I mean, the population numbers don't actually are just there because I think state law requires that you have population projections, even though they don't really affect the fees. It's dwelling units and non-residential square footage that actually do the fee. Or we could put a caveat that, you know, just leave those numbers as they are in the study, but also add that that the population projections might be a little low.
Yeah, that sounds like something that maybe we can add into the report.
I kind of doubt there's going to be any real problem with having these numbers not be exactly the same as what the city's current estimates are, but we can see what the city can come up with.
Madam Chair, we have another hand raised in the queue. Ms. Little, you may unmute yourself and proceed.
My economic development question did not get answered. That was the only thing I want to mention again in terms of the jobs created.
Jonathan, how does the city currently track? I know I've read a good bit about this, but how is the city working to tighten or better track those figures? Or Janity or Tiffany?
Yeah, I might have to defer to Janity or Tiffany on that. I'm not sure of any efforts currently by the city on ensuring that the opportunities be inside the city?
Yeah, that would be something, this is Janet speaking, that would be something we would need to check with Invest Atlanta on. So we'd be happy to check into that and get back to the advisory committee as well as Ms. Little.
Okay, Madam Chair, that concludes all the hands we have raised for public comment.
Whoops, sorry. Seeing that there is no additional public comment, are there any additional comments or announcements from staff?
Yes, thank you. Please join us for our next DIFAC meeting scheduled virtually for Wednesday, January 20th, 2021, 2 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our agenda. I will entertain a motion to adjourn and complete the exiting roll call. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Seeing as we have a second, we'll take a vote to adjourn. Jim Brown,
Adjourn.
Stacy
Second.
McCoy,
Second.
Rod Teachy, Kevin Green.
Adjourn, yes.
Okay, the motion carries with a vote of Malloy Peterson. Adjourn carries with a vote of 4 yeas, 0 nays. We're adjourned. See you in January.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Bye.